a moment to start. Yes, we're talking about interconnections. We began a seminar series in Russia. We moved to Germany. We moved to Greece. Last week we were in the States, or the States and relations with Europe. Today we go to Italy, perhaps to the heart of Europe, and we focus on a poet, philosopher of enormous import, but perhaps one that the Anglophone world is less familiar with than it should be. The poet philosopher who is said to have had huge influence on Schopenhauer, on Nietzsche, but equally, looking backwards, really takes up the baton where perhaps another even more forgotten figure, the poet playwright Alfieri, begun a program of cultural nationalism, which equally looked back to Rome and Rome's literary heritage as a way of not only forging national identity, but also a new Italian language. Our speakers today, or our main speaker today, is Rosa Mucignat from King's College London. Rosa is senior lecturer in comparative literature. She has written on a book in 2013 called Realism and States of the Novel, 1790 to 1869. And much of her work has been concerned with thinking about place and places in European and world cultures, ranging from the 18th century right up into the 21st century. She currently has an AHRC project called Radical Translations, which focuses on French, or sort of revolutionary texts during the period of the French Revolution, texts written in English, Italian, and French. She also has an interest in modernity and the way that minor and endangered languages have functioned and hopefully will continue to function within modernity. Our respondent today is Emanuela Tandello, known by most of us as Ella Tandello, who Christchurch. She's the tutor in modern languages. She works on contemporary Italian poetry. She's perhaps best known for her work on modernist drama and Pirandello in particular. The last few years, she's been working within and very much at the heart of Leopardi studies in Oxford, a centre for studies in Leopardi. And she's asked me to highlight a forthcoming conference entitled Contaminations, which will be hosted at Christchurch in June of next year, hopefully in person, but perhaps we have to say rather optimistically in person. But if it does not happen in person, it will definitely take place, as we are now taking place, online. And I think Ella may say some more words about that conference later in the session today, but I know she very much welcomes people who are on this call or people who listen to it at a later stage when it's recorded to contact to find out more about contaminations at the conference next summer. So as in previous weeks, we will hand over to our speaker, to Rosa, and then go straight from Rosa to Ella to respond. And when both finished, we will take a 10-minute break, then return for the questions. So thank you so much, both of you, for coming, and I hand over to Rosa.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity, and thank you, David, as well. So today I'm going to talk about, my topic is antiquity and the modern politics of boredom in Leopardi and Stendhal. I'm going to be talking about Leopardi, as Fiona says, but as a comparatist, I have to sneak in a second terminus, and that would be Stendhal today. And I hope you will find enough classical literature in it to make it worthy of being in this series, for this paper to be in this series. I'm afraid I haven't engaged too closely with classical sources in the sense I've made textual points, but I'll be talking more in general about a certain idea of classical antiquity rather than making reference to particular texts. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to share my screen so that when the questions in Italian come up, I'll be saying them in Italian, and you can look at them on my slides in the English translation. So I'm going to do that now. Good. So in common use, boredom indicates the awareness one feels when unoccupied or up in an interesting or repetitive activities. In a stronger sense, it defines the sense of meaninglessness and futility of life and the impossibility to invest fully in any action. Ancient and medieval cultures are aware of associated psychological conditions such as tedium, acedia, and melancholy. But boredom itself has a much more recent history. In the Romance languages, the terms connected to Latin odium, such as Italian noia or French ennui, shift from the semantic sphere of nuisance to that of boredom after 1600. In English, boredom is first attested in 1768 and becomes a vogue word around 1780. It appears that these new words or new meanings of old words emerged in response to a new kind of experience that existing terminology wasn't able to capture. If boredom is indeed a modern phenomenon, one might ask, what aspects of the modern mind make it susceptible to boredom, and what are the consequences of boredom, not only for the individual, but for society at large? To answer these questions, I consider the phenomenology of boredom as it emerges from writing by Stendhal and Leopardi, both of whom reflected on the state of Europe after Waterloo, with a focus on Italy. Despite reaching opposite conclusions about the Italians, as I shall show in a moment, Stendhal and Leopardi approach boredom through the same premise of a comparison between ancient and modern societies, and as a world historical problem. Leopardi returns often to the problem of noia in his writings, offering multiple and at times contrasting definitions. But he consistently associates it with nothingness and emptiness of feeling, although he considers it a passion in itself, taking hold of the mind when it is unoccupied by either pleasure or pain. Some groups are more vulnerable to boredom than others: the moderns, old people, and the Italians, especially those from the leisure class, for whom life is nothing else than pura, infinita, profondissima e pesantissima noia, pure, infinite, depthless, and most oppressive boredom. Stendhal too sees boredom as a counterpoint to energy and passion, and as the malady of his time. There are no genuine passions left in the 19th century. That's why people are so bored in France, says Count Altamira in the Rouge et le Noir, a Neapolitan liberal sentenced to death in his homeland. Altamira's talk of revolution punctures the boredom of a high society Parisian ball. Like Leopardi, Stendhal draws on Rousseau, but describes the Italians as natural, passionate, and unphilosophic, unencumbered by the fear of ridicule that has turned the French into a nation of vaniteux. Both Leopardi and Stendhal looked at boredom as a marker of the deeply unsatisfying outcomes of the Restoration and of so-called progress, and analyzed the Italian psyche to uncover the link between ennui, cultural development, and the state of the political franchise. Stendhal creates the image of passionate primitive Italians as a foil to the fatuity and ostentation of more civilized nations like France. Conversely, Leopardi depicts it as a paralyzed spirit afflicted by noia. The question, are the Italians bored, is thus closely connected to another, namely, are the Italians modern? The idea that boredom increases with age and accumulated experience was first applied to the history of human societies in the 18th century. The emergence of leisure, as well as new notions of subjectivity and identity, contributed to making boredom into a central problem of civilized existence. One of the ever-recurring points in Leopardi's theory of pleasure is la superiorità del mondo antico sul moderno, in ordine alla felicità, come pure dell'età fanciullesca giovanile sulla matura. And since old age has become an effect of civilization, all moderns are older even when they're young. There are many examples of this crisscrossing of historical and biological time in Leopardi's poems, where it is explored lyrically in relation to the individual subject. In Il Passero Solitario, the solitary thrush, the speaker regrets his inability to enjoy the pleasures of youth, which he finds himself unnaturally shunning, almost despite his better judgment. And I quote, "A me, se di vecchiezza la detestata soglia evitarono impetro, quando muti questi occhi all'altrui core, e lor fia vuoto il mondo, e il di futuro del di presente più noioso e tetro, che mi parrà di tal voglia." Old age, then, is not just a biological fact, but a state of mind, colored by the dark shades of noia. Another example. In 1819, Angelo Mai, the chief keeper of the Vatican Library, scraped a copy of St. Augustine's commentary on the Psalms with a tannin solution to find underneath large fragments of Cicero's De Repubblica. The antiquarian world erupted in jubilation, and May became the poster boy for Italian intellectual researchers. Leopardi wrote a canzone for Mai, but his song is not one of praise, at least not unequivocally. Excitement for the discovery doesn't reverse a history of decline. A che posi di svegliar dalle tombe i nostri padri e a parlargli meni a questo secol morto, al quale incombe tanta nebbia di tedio. The age of heroes is over, the time when nature parlò senza svelarsi, spoke without giving herself away. Leopardi evokes Columbus, another illustrious Italian, whose discovery expanded knowledge and consequently boredom. Hai ma conosciuto il mondo non cresce, anzi si scema, è assai più vasto, l'etra sonata, la terra, il mare, al saggio non al saggio appare. That imagination and illusions, which are central to poetry and our only chance of happiness, are annihilated by reason, is a tenet that Leopardi shares with much romantic culture, of which he was largely unaware of, but reached independently through Vico's ideas on ancient wisdom. The French querelle raised two separate questions. One, did the ancients than the moderns? And two, Have they achieved more in the fields of literature and the arts? It had become impossible to maintain the primacy in the field of contemporary science and Cartesian philosophy. And Leopardi himself wrote an essay on the errors of the ancients in 1815, which he dedicated to Andrea Mustoxidi, the Greek historian. But Vico managed to score for the ancient by discovering that prima sapientia vulgaris fuit poetica. Because because it lacked rationality. This is a quote from Vico. Hence, it is privileged to be the foremost of all the sublime or heroic poets in terms of both merit and age. This explains why Leopardi describes with such gusto the telltale signs of the art in the Homeric poems, such as repetitions, redundancies, contradictions, and the superabundance of epithets used out of place for reason or purpose. A taste for over-ornamentation he regards as the same as that of children when they write their exercising rhetoric. All through his life, Leopardi sided with the classicists, even as he gave serious thought to some of the Romantics' claims and solutions. His historicism set him apart from both sides and forbade him to advocate either the pedantic imitation of classical models, the defenders of antiquity, or the creative possibilities of the imagination, so tempting to the Romantics, but which now had to give place, however regretfully, to reason. This is why, he says, un Omero, un Ariosto non sono per gli tempi nostri, né credo per gli avvenire. A Homer not made for our times, or I believe for the future. So moderns must forge their own path in their fight against boredom, abandon attempts to resurrect the defunct natural imagination, and resign themselves to writing in the cerebral, artificial mode of sentimental poetry. Leopardi notes that in this the Italians, contrary to their reputation for passion, has a strong disadvantage to other European. Egli sente nulla. Are indifferent to moral norms and the conventions of polite society. You find this in Lady Morgan in Stalin Byron. But the way they assess this situation is entirely different. For Stendhal, Italy's backwardness is a blessing that makes it immune to the evils of over-civilization, delivering Italians back to a state of pre-social natural happiness. In his prison in the Farnese Tower, Fabrice del Dongo, the hero of the Chartreuse de Parme, the Charter House of Parma, is astonished to find he feels nothing of the black despair he expected to experience in confinement, but is actually quite elated and wonders, might I be one of those valiant souls of which antiquity showed the world some examples? Am I a hero without realizing it? So a hero is somebody who doesn't get bored. The Charter House is a fast-paced succession of adventures, passionate affairs, and intrigues, which Stendhal insists could, and I quote, no longer happen in a country where the sole passion that has outlasted all others is money, the instrument of vanity. That is France. Chasing after love, glory, or revenge in the manner of ancient heroes, it appears Stendhal's characters have no time to feel bored. By contrast, Leopardi considers the absence of a società stretta, a close-knit society, which we might translate with civil society, perhaps, of the kind that exists in France and England, to be the main cause of noia. He explains in the Discorso sullo stato presente dei costumi degli italiani, discourse on the present state of the manners of Italians, that due to the political fragmentation of the peninsula, the Italians lack a nation state in which to invest their energies. And as a consequence, they're untouched by passions such as love of country, honor, and personal ambition. From a purely rational point of view, all these things are illusions. And because the Italians are immune from the psychological constraints of the società stretta, they see through the fiction that underpins all forms of morality and imagined communities and do not care to join in. This is why boredom has become a political and an ethical problem. And this is a quote from the Discorso, which is not translated into English, so I'll give my own translation. Come la disperazione, così né più né meno il disprezzo e l'intimo sentimento della vanità della vita sono i maggiori nemici del bene operare e autori del male e della immoralità. Just as despair, so too contempt for life and a deep-rooted sense of the vanity of it all are the worst enemies of good actions and beget evil and immorality. Chilling as it is, however, Leopardi's portrayal of Italy under the Restoration has more in common with Stendhal's optimistic anthropology than might at first appear. Although Stendhal was not possessed of Leopardi's classical erudition, he too thought seriously about the rhythm of civilization and barbarism. In Les Rouges et les Noirs, Julien Sorel, when still a student at the seminary, impresses the Bishop of Besançon with his learning. He quotes some Horace, and the prelate presents him with a finely bound edition of Tacitus, along with the comment that, and I quote, "The end of paganism was accompanied by the same state of anxiety and doubt which afflicts gloomy and bored minds in the 19th century." It is one of Stendhal's exquisite ironies that he should choose the works of Tacitus, a pagan author with a whiff of subversion about him, as present for the young seminarist. Evidently, the bishop, a nobleman and an excellent humanist, we are told, is not unduly worried about mixing sacred and profane. His comment on paganism and the fall of the Roman Empire might be an allusion to Gibbon, who, as is well known, took Tacitus as the model of the philosophical historian who shines light on the revolutions of society. From the Renaissance onwards, Tacitus has been the authority on the breakdown of liberty in the Roman world, and was one of the authors most cited in debates and the press in France during the Revolution. According to Arnaldo Momigliano, it is because of Tacitus' Anatomy of Tyranny that we still see the transition from the Republic to the Principate as a crux of Roman history. Tacitus' account of the hypocrisy, hedonism, and self-interest engendered by absolute power has become a feature of political psychology. But as far as I'm aware, he never says that the Romans were bored. It's Stendhal who adds this facet to the picture of society under despotism and of suspended life in the interregnum when, to say it with Gramsci, the old world is dying and the new struggles to be born. The Charterhouse of Parma opens with the Revolutionary Army entering Milan in 1796, ushering in a new era of enthusiasm. And this is a quote. "People realized that in order to be happy after centuries of insipid sensations, it was necessary to feel a genuine passion for one's country and to seek out heroic actions. The occupying French soldiers are young and full of life, and the Milanese are instantly smitten. Striving to give a sense of the exhilaration of the moment, Stendhal writes, the delirium was so great and so universal that it would be impossible for me to convey any idea of it other than by making the following historical and profound observation. These people had been living in boredom for 100 years. It is remarkable that both Leopardi and Stendhal contrast boredom not just with youth and the imagination, but with the particular passions of patriotism and civic virtue. The spectacle of a reawakened Italy is an awesome one for Stendhal. But it is over in a flash. The rest of the novel deals with the aftermath of Waterloo and shows a country that has relapsed into ennui. In Parma, I die of boredom, confesses Count Mosca to the exuberant, beautiful Gina Sanseverina. And Gina's company soon becomes indispensable to the Prince of Parma himself, who was sometimes afraid and often bored. Stendhal based his portrayal of Ranus Ernest IV, gripped by an obsessive fear of conspiracies, on the Tiberius of Tacitus' annals. Not unlike Tiberius's, the prince's grip on power is insecure because the Restoration has reimposed tyranny to an Italy that had been accustomed, however briefly, to liberty under the French. The tin pot dictators of the Restoration are older men who have the power to suppress liberty, to command stasis, and to combine this stasis with anguish. Stendhal knows this combination of boredom and power to be farcical, but nonetheless lethal. He tells us that in a moment of boredom and anger, one fine day Ernest IV had two liberals hanged. Boredom kills, and this is how tyranny works. Leopardi, reader of Tacitus and of Montesquieu and Rousseau, is clear about the superiority of barbarism to excessive civilization, which brings corruption, weakens the natural passions, and leads to the loss of political freedom. This, as we have seen, is the time of individualism and noia. Europe cannot return to barbarism any more than a modern can write the Iliad. The freedom of the ancients, when they too were barbarians, is forever out of reach. Unless, that is, a return to a new barbarism makes it possible. This has been the exceptional yet ephemeral achievement of the French Revolution, che mettendo sul campo ogni sorta di passioni e ravvivando ogni sorta di illusioni, ravvicinò la Francia alla natura, spinse indietro l'incivilimento e ritornò la Francia allo stato di nazione e di patria che aveva perduto sotto i re. So, as Vico teaches us, corso can turn around and become ricorso once again. To conclude, I'd like to argue that Stendhal's and Leopardi's parallel lives of boredom are not a quirk in literary history, but highly individualized and creative responses to a new understanding of the relationship between history, psychology, and the political sphere. A new understanding that, like many of the major nodes of Western thought, was structured and fractured by the contrast between antiquity and modernity. Thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Oh, sorry, I see the comment now that you couldn't see the slides.
No, we could see the slides. It was just you could see that it was in PowerPoint. That's
I know. Sorry, that's because I had my Word file open as well to read. I should have had two screens.
No, it's fine. We can all see the text.
Great, thank you.
Over to you, Ella, when you're ready.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to work out how. Can you all see me? And you can all hear me? Yes. All right. Okay. Thank you. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to respond to Rosa's paper. It is a rare pleasure to be able to discuss Leopardi in the context of a culture that still doesn't really know his work enough. And now we are in the position to be able to do that more since his Zibaldone appeared in the English translation a few years ago. And he is a colossal figure, and we still have a great deal to learn about him precisely within a European context, a context of European thought. This individual who worked very much for several years in a backwater in the Vatican State, often didn't manage to publish his work, some of his treatises, including the discorso sullo stato presente degli italiani that Rosa has just quoted. So I think it's never too late. This is a very, very good moment to start talking about him in relation to also a more of a historical and political context. I'd like to thank Rosa for this paper, which is full of interesting points, important points. I'm going to comment on three major points. That there's a great deal, of course, to say, but I'm limiting myself to three major points. The first point is just to contextualize a little bit more the notion of noia in Leopardi as very much a sort of contradictory notion, but also as a condition that is characteristic, very much characteristic of modernity in his view. The second point is closer to Stendhal, and to Stendhal jointly with many other writers who looked to Italy, traveled in Italy, and gave us in their work a sort of the view of outsiders in particular in relation to backwardness and a possible charm of it that clearly Leopardi does not share. My third point is going to be to talk a little bit about the idea of barbarism or barbarie as actually different from antico. So I'll start by talking a little bit about noia, if I may. I think in the case of Leopardi, noia is really, really tricky to translate because it is lots of different things at the same time and actually contradictory things. I think, you know, the first point I'd like to make about it is that noia is a sort of, is the opposite of our desire for the infinite, because Leopardi says that there's a difference between the pleasure that we imagine and the pleasure that we experience in life, in the everyday. So that there is a chasm between desire and its fulfillment. So as Leopardi says in Zibaldone, noia is il desiderio di felicità lasciato puro, without ever the hope of fulfilling it. Noia is bound up with the passing of time and the lack of occupations, but it is also the thought that makes us realize the smallness of objects in relation to this measureless extension of desire. Leopardi calls it il più sublime dei sentimenti umani, the most sublime of human sentiment, using sublime as it was very much used at that time of something that is that thrills and frightens us, but also reveals, cracks open that lack of coming together of happiness and its fulfillment. And another contradictory point is we find in one of the pensieri, one of his thoughts, Leopardi says, it is actually il maggior segno di grandezza e di nobiltà. It's the greatest sign of greatness and nobility che si vegga della natura umana, that comes from human nature. So there is indeed a very negative side of it that Rosa has spoken about very well. But there is also this sense that there is this grandezza and nobiltà. It is only those souls who are privileged to feel noia. And one final point about this, and I'm quoting from a wonderful essay by Alessandra Loisi in relation to that pensiero, to accuse the world and things within it as insufficient and of accusing them of nothingness and suffering from this sense of lack of absence seems to me, says Leopardi, the greatest sign of a human soul. This, I think, is directly connected with modernity and with the fact that noia is the characteristic malaise of modernity. Again, we should remember that for Leopardi, modernity is a negative, is very much a negative notion. But I'll come back to that if I may, or perhaps if there are questions. Coming to what Stendhal says and his own view, and an idea of italianità. For Leopardi, italianità is a kind of category of spirit which is on the cusp between ancient and modern, but at the same time lacks the contents of both. Okay, so it's on the cusp, but it's got very little foothold in either. Italy has lost the foundations, the ancient foundations of social life without managing to gain those produced by civilization. And it's worth noting what he says about the French in the Discorso sullo Stato Presente. He said that the collapse of values that had occurred after the French Revolution is somewhat similar to the situation in Italy, but actually is saved by the French bon ton. It is the only foundation that remains, it's the only resource that remains to a civilization belonging, as Rosa was saying, to a società stretta. It is, this bon ton is a sort of religion that allows citizens, human beings in contemporary France to feel the same degree of shame whether you turn up with a stain on your suit, as well as actually perpetrating evil. It is a kind of religion upon which a sort of progressively nihilistic society can anchor itself. Italy does not have this. Okay, Italy, for the reasons that Rosa has outlined, it does not experience this. So with this Stendhal and Leopardi are, of course, very, very different. They were contemporaries. Leopardi met Stendhal. Stendhal was his sister's favorite author. So we have a wonderful letter when he's writing to Paolina and he says, "Ho conosciuto il tuo Stendhal." I have met your Stendhal. So he was familiar with Stendhal. I'm not really sure that Stendhal was familiar with Leopardi, but I'm not actually an expert on that side at all. But it seems to me that Stendhal gives us a view of Italy that is very much cognate to those authors that Rosa mentioned, like Byron and Madame de Staël in particular. And it is the kind of point of view that derives from the fact, as Leopardi says in the Discorso sullo stato presente degli Italiani, that the peninsula has become un oggetto di curiosità universale e di viaggi, has become an object of universal curiosity and an object of travels. So it's become an anthropological unicum that in foreigners stirs either blame or enthusiasm. We only have to think of Madame de Staël's letter to Italian poets and intellectuals telling them that they should translate more from Northern European literature and abandoning the classics altogether. So it stirs either blame or enthusiasm, but it is not really a proper evaluation of the state of the country, of the state of Italy. Now, this is important as both Stendhal and Madame de Staël give a view of Italy from the outside, as I said, that simply doesn't coincide with an Italian's view, and specifically a Leopardian point of view. They represent what has been called il tempo del settentrione, the time of the north. And there's a very good book by Joseph Luzzi where he writes that Italy, in these writers, appears as a pre-modern, sensual and unreflective oasis. And this supposedly pre-modern status in European literature of the early 19th century results in a loving mystification by foreigners of Italy's ancient and Renaissance heritage. On the other, foreign dismissal of more modern forms of cultural expression because of their tradition-bound and classicizing elements is something that Leopardi was to react very, very aggressively, if you like, and very buoyantly in his reply to Madame de Staël's letter of 1816. Another example with Stendhal is Madame de Staël's Corinne, which paradoxically became one of Leopardi's favorite books. But that reads to us today as a guide to the standard devices of its day. It displays a preoccupation with national character, champions the emotions. Corinne is all passion, as opposed to her British lover being all rationality. It celebrates the natural over the man-made and renders homage to the power of art to shape morality and society. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not talking too much, but my last point is about barbarie. And it seems to me that this is something really important that we need to bear in mind. In the Discorso, Leopardi does not associate barbarie with antico in classical terms. Il moderno non nasce in contrapposizione allo stato antico. Modernity that is not born in opposition to the ancient state, but to the barbarie dei tempi bassi. That means the Middle Ages. So Leopardi suggests that what Italians need to do is combat this idea of the Renaissance, for example, as having fought barbarie or having fought antiquity, but indeed the mystification of the Middle Ages. So the rediscovery of Antico consists in the recovery of the power of the imagination and of customs, but it is rooted in antiquità. And antiquità in Leopardi is not an archaeological knowledge, but the result of a way of perceiving antiquity as something other from what we are. So he's actually really talking about a melancholy of antiquity. That's what I was, I'm coming to that point. Antico is never a ruin or a memory, but it's actually a sort of tonality of desire which is immanent to the modern. So these are just some ideas that that Rosa's excellent paper made me think about. I hope I didn't talk too long. Thank you very much for listening.